to The Truth in This Art, Beyond, and we're back in New Orleans, the Big Easy, and I am your host, Rob Lee. And I'm excited to be in conversation with my next guest, musicologist, music historian, writer, radio personality, DJ, music curator for the New Orleans Jazz Museum. Please welcome David Kunian. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on. Thank you for making the time as we were chatting a little bit. And long time coming, I got to admit, because we were in here when I came out here initially, and I was like, all right. I was like, we're going to have actual time to do this between getting shrimp and grits. That's what I come down here for.
You're a shrimp and grits guy?
I am.
Okay.
If I haven't had it, I feel like it was a wasted trip.
I'm with you. Yeah. I'm with you. I haven't had it in a while. I'm trying to think of a good place. The place where I used to go for shrimp and grits that had the best is closed now, but that doesn't mean, there are 500,000 still other places you can get good shrimp and grits. So.
And as a person that, I'm a cornbread guy as well. Mm-hmm. So I like the very, kind of grainy sort of, I don't like it, I don't want it to be spoon bread.
Right.
So it's just look, let's just make it this. So it's something about that granularity that's there. Yeah. I'm a data guy, so I get down to the individual kernels of data or corn.
Right.
So before we get started into the more of this sort of hot food talk, even though we're in a jazz museum, I want to give you the space to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about your background and what was the music you were listening to growing up?
I'm 54 years old, so I grew up, in the 70s and early, 70s and 80s. I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, which continues to be a great radio town.
Yeah.
There has always been great radio there. So I listened to the radio when I was a kid, and listened to, the whatever bands were in Boston. What were the radio stations? WBCN, WCOZ, and the DJs there who were a hoot. I still, I still do. I'm a radio DJ, and I still, use some of their, sayings and stuff like that. So I grew up listening to kind of, Boston was a big disco town, so I'd listen to disco. I didn't really listen to jazz or blues back then as a kid, but stuff like the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, the Grease soundtrack. Donna Summer was huge. She came from Roxbury in Boston, so they played her a lot. And then got into kind of classic rock like everybody else. And then I don't remember why I got into punk rock. About the same time I got into jazz in my early teens, I got into punk rock and hardcore because Boston's a big town for that too, which influences me to this day. That whole do-it-yourself aspect of everything, of watching, bands put on their own shows, do their own kind of music that wasn't commercial at all, and I kept. Listening to that all through, all through the 80s, when there was the great, very definitive divide of, here's the hair metal and here's all the, what became alternative and indie rock and underground music. And then in the 90s when that, suddenly became mainstream, which was, a beautiful thing. It really, for a while, I was like, oh yeah, we won. And then, we didn't. It's like, wait, all of these great bands are now selling and making money and people are hearing them and influencing the culture. That's kind of what I came up listening to. And I played piano for a while. So that also got me listening to, modern jazz and New York jazz and stuff like that. And then when I got to college, I started hearing New Orleans brass band music, the Rebirth Brass Band and the Dirty Dozen.
Yeah.
And that got me into New Orleans. And then I started coming down from Mardi Gras. And then when I was going to college at Columbia and got out of there and kind of went, what do I do now? Well, I'm a jazz DJ, I'm a poet, and I'm a history major, and I'm a good bartender. So why not go to New Orleans for a couple years? Go to New Orleans for a couple years, figure it out. My brother was going to Tulane, so I figured I'd come live here for a couple years. If it didn't work out, I'd move back to the East Coast and figure it out there. And I ended up hooking up with WWOZ and getting a show on there and learning how to do radio production. And then once I learned radio production, I started doing radio documentaries and funding them through local and state granting and humanities and arts organizations.
Wow.
And never did about 10 or 12 of those, all radio, and funded them through the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, the Louisiana Division of the Arts. Did a bunch of those. Then, of course, the recession, all of that fell apart, and I went back to school to get a degree in musicology. And right as about a year after I got out, the job of the curator, the music curator for the State Museum and curator of the Jazz Museum came up, and I applied and got it. And I've been here since 2016. January.
Wow. I mean, that's the episode, folks. We're out of here. We're done.
Right. that's the life story in the last kind of 30 years and 40 years in a nutshell.
No, that's great. And I want to comment on one thing that I definitely have to share, and I know I've shared it on the podcast relatively recently. I went to, I look at the way that I approach podcasting in a Mingus sort of way. And so it might be like, I'll throw this brass at you kind of thing. And it was one of the things where I was at a record store in Hamden in Baltimore, and I was like, man, I want to get this record. And I forget what it may have been. Black Saint and Sinner Lady, what have it. I don't remember exactly what it was. I do have it.
It's one of the best records ever made.
Absolutely. And I just remember it was like this punk dude there. He's wearing all the black. Everything is just like super tight spikes, all of that. And I was like, all right, cool. And a girl takes it. She goes over there and she's like, yeah, I'm going to get this. And he's like, it's really good taste, man. And for years, she takes credit for an album that I picked out and that she was buying for me. And she's like, yeah, it is good taste I have. I was like, yo, I picked that. But
and the guy with the spikes was like, that's a great record.
and it's that thing where musicianship is musicianship. And people know good records. And I always found that it was something sort of interesting when you talk with someone who sort of has this punk background, this punk aesthetic, this lifestyle attached to it, and then they're into like jazz, which I think a lot of times it's like, oh, there's a suit on here. I think of like a certain era at a point, and then seeing something that looks kind of like the anti of it. But there's something about the sensibility, I think, or maybe how they approach music that just resonates.
Well, I always the circle comes around where certain punk rock and certain kinds of punk rock and quote unquote alternative music meets up with avant-garde with jazz, and certainly avant-garde jazz in a big way, where the guys in Sonic Youth were totally into Sun Ra, and the guys in Fugazi are into all sorts of stuff like that, and it's like there's definitely a meeting point between those two things.
I will say the other thing about it. The only records, right, that I have in my home are actually, with the exception of like one Toro, maybe two Toro EY albums, the rest of them are jazz albums, right? And I'm very considerate of what I have in my space. You have a limited amount of space, so I can't have like 4,000 records in there. It's like, this has to be good for it to be in here. And it's something about it. And I'll say, going to Morgan State University, me and my dad would work together. And we would have that station on. And I was going to the school at the time. I was like, man, can you turn that off? I don't listen to this jazz nonsense. And he was like, he'd just give me the eye roll. And it was kind of like, oh, now as an adult recognizing like, oh no, jazz is fire.
I have an 11 and a 13-year-old who are forced to listen to all of this stuff, and they slightly roll their eyes. They like some of the brass band stuff, and some it's kid oriented. But I know, and I'm like, I'm going to get them now, so that they will rebel like we all do, and listen to whatever they're going to listen to that I can't stand, and. Though I like a lot of their pop music, but they'll come back around when they're 25 and go, wait, that crazy John Coltrane stuff that Dad was listening to, that was all right. I like that stuff. Yeah.
And I think because I'm very much a taste guy, I know what I like. I think what happened was, it's like, I didn't like smooth jazz. I think that's what it was. And when I started listening to like brass band, hard bop, things of that nature, it's like, oh no, this is for me.
Right. This is the real deal. This is, again, smooth jazz is perfectly fine stuff. It's just titled wrong. And as we all know, it's like they call it because it's made by African Americans and it has saxophones and it's like, oh, it must be. It's like, no, call it instrumental pop or something, because that's what it is. It's good if you look at it from that perspective. If you don't, it's like this, But then again, as from someone who is trying to, sell jazz on a museum perspective, and the whole idea of calling it jazz is another argument we can have for days. But anything that brings people into jazz and they think of as jazz, even is fine by me. However you get into it and start liking it and start digging it and possibly going deeper into it, whatever your gateway is into it, is fine by me.
Yeah, I think the way that I got pulled in was, it always is a pop culture thing. It's like, how does it get to me? And I look at it like, I'd rather have the Smoky Jazz Club late, like, all right, there's some ill repute things going on here. This is great. Versus, man, I'm going to have eggs and cantaloupe. There's the jazz brunch. I don't want that. That's just the vibe for me.
And for all teens are rebellious. But one of the things that got me into it, of it being, and blues too, is that it is still, even though it's more mainstream, but it is rebellious music. It is outlaw music. And the folks who did it were not mainstream. They were not a part of the culture. And, they did what they wanted. They had their own ideas. And they did drugs. They stayed up all night. They had all sorts of, dramatic adventures and stuff. And that, when you're 15 years old, that is incredibly appealing.
100%.
I want to be a part of that. I want to be at 2 a.m. with Charlie Parker and Miles Davis with a knife on me kind of thing, And that's at 15. Then you start realizing that, after a while you go, oh, that, that is an inherent part of it, but not the kind of part you necessarily get when you get older. You're like, I'm not so sure that Charlie Parker shooting up was such a great thing.
No, because the story ends earlier.
Yeah, because as I've started, now that I'm of this age, I've started noting when I have outlived certain. It's like, oh, I outlived Charlie Parker. Oh, I outlived John Coltrane. And that ain't good. It's good for me to be living, but it's not good that they're not here now.
That almost reminds me of this, and I got some other questions, because now we're just kind of, but it reminds me of this joke that Hannibal Buress said, and he's one of the reasons I've actually came to New Orleans for the first time.
We love Hannibal. Yeah. His take on New Orleans is so hilarious.
And I remember he had mentioned something about, I look at, musicians, rappers specifically, of, where am I at in their age thing. And it's like, am I going to outlive, this person? He's like, I'm going to probably outlive Lil Wayne. He drinks syrup without any, medical conditions. And I was like, that's really funny. He's like, but I'm not going to outlive Will Smith. He's like, I hope I do, so I can see that Fire Fresh Prince marathon. It makes me laugh. So talk about the musicology piece. What is a musicologist? How did you kind of get interest to pursue that as sort of it's a vocation. It's a pursuit. Talk about why did you pursue music as a profession, musicology? Talk about that a bit.
Well, people always ask, what is musicology? And the way I kind of define it, for me, and technically, since I'm dealing with not classical music, it is technically ethnomusicology, but I call it musicology. Musicology is the study of everything in music except how to play the instrument. Yeah. So I got into it on a kind of a historical and sociological, anthropological basis, because I was doing these documentaries, and I would go out and research the history of James Booker and Earl King and Guitar Slim, and do like we're doing right now. I would find folks and I would interview them about these folks. And I found that in New Orleans especially, but the stories behind the music and how the music came to be created and the places where it was created and the people and stuff were endlessly fascinating, hilarious, and the people who made it, who have made this music in New Orleans, are the most incredible bunch of, and I think it's everywhere, but certainly more in New Orleans because it's New Orleans, the most incredible bunch of characters you've ever heard.
Yeah.
I mean, you got, folks like Earl King, James Booker, Ernie Cato, Dr. John. And that's just off the top of, and that's just the R&B guys off the top of my head. When you get to, some of the trad guys and you start figuring out, Louis Armstrong, is a hoot of a character. When you find out about Buddy Bolden and what we know about him kind of thing. Baby Dodds, all of these guys are just interesting folk and went about their lives in interesting ways and thought in interesting ways. So that's kind of how I got into it. And one thing you find out about researching music in New Orleans is that the further you get into it, the more connected it is, and the more interesting it is, and you find out about places and people that you never heard of, and the kind of the history, or kind of not written out of the history, but just didn't become a part of the history as we perceive it, and then you start finding out that a lot of the early. A lot of the stuff about early jazz and early R&B, no one's really people haven't done a whole lot of research on. I taught jazz for a while, just at Tulane as an adjunct, and I would tell people, one of the most interesting things to me about jazz, just as you're looking at its historical thing, is that, for instance, we know, basically what Mozart did every day of his life. Mm-hmm. People have researched it. We know where Beethoven was on the 20th of February 17 whatever. Okay, yeah. We know that. But the origins of jazz and a lot of the early stuff is incredibly mysterious. We don't know. Louis Armstrong. We don't know what day he was born.
Wow.
We think we do. Yeah. We have, he said he was born on July 4th, 1900. There is a baptismal certificate that, Tad Jones found that says, it's August 4th, 1901. We don't know.
Right.
It could be both. I take them both. Yeah. Pops is good enough. He can have two birthdays. Jelly Roll Morton. We don't have a birth certificate. Yeah. Buddy Bolden, the guy who most people think is the first guy to kind of synthesize all the elements in the late 1800s. We have no idea what he sounded like. Never recorded. Wow. We have people singing as solos. We have some descriptions of it, but we don't know. And yet, this is a music that is now worldwide and associated with America and African Americans and the whole thing that jazz is. But the origins are still incredibly murky, and will continue to be.
Yeah.
And so there's those elements of it, and there's always stuff that's, I'm always looking out for, figuring out who some of the early folks were and how much more we can know about them, kind of thing. So so that's endlessly fascinating about figuring out why to get into this. And the deeper you get, the more the more interesting it becomes. And yet, on the contemporary level, the music is still, and I'm talking about any kind of music made in New Orleans, but certainly the jazz, the R&B is the same way. But the people who are making it now, half of them, are like seventh generation musicians. Yeah. They're a guy like Big Sam. Big Sam's great-grandfather was Buddy Bolden. So, Wendell Brunius, his entire family, the Batiste, the Barberins, all of these guys, this lineage is passed down so that some of the Barberin guys are playing, their great-grandfathers, they're the guys who invented how to do it. Yeah. And all of these guys learned from the folks who invented actually how to make this music. And you can hear it. Yeah. There's something incredibly deep and inherently beautiful about that kind of passed down.
You hear about the royalty thing where it's like you hear about the Marsalises, right? Yeah. It's just like, oh, that name just keeps coming up. Oh, that's the next generation. Yeah. And that's the next oh, that's the cousin, that's the nephew, and so on.
And then you start finding out, people intermarry, and suddenly it's like the family tree of New Orleans music in general is like, oh my goodness. Yeah. You look at Herlin Riley. His mom was Betty Ann, who was a gospel organist and also played a little bit of jazz. Her brothers were Melvin, David, and I'm blanking on a lot, and Walter. Yeah. All of whom played traditional jazz and traditional music in there. Their dad was Deacon Frank, who played drums a little bit in the church in the Ninth Ward, who was friends with Alvin Batiste and Kid Jordan, and hung out with Ornette Coleman when Ornette Coleman was here, kind of thing. Knew Ed Blackwell. I mean, I could go on and on.
No,
this is it's still here. And the other thing that's most important is that most other places jazz is a part of is in the culture and stuff, but here is an inherent part of the culture, and it is still a living, breathing music that matters to a lot of people here, and certainly even if you don't like jazz, and I've told this to people, people, you're like, when you hear Bourbon Street Parade, you're still going like this and moving the umbrella and moving, okay? Yeah. You're still hearing, you're still liking it even if you don't, you're like, I don't like that stuff. Like, yeah, but you know what? When you're in the parade and it gets played, you're listening to it. You like it, it's an inherent part of the culture.
You can't stop it. It can't be denied.
Yeah, and even when you get to the more modern brass bands who are playing more kind of hip hop and great stuff like that, it's still totally informed by jazz and by the previous generations of the Dirty Dozen, the Soul Rebels, the Rebirth, the Onward, all the old brass bands. It all comes down through that, and they all know that. So,
and that's one of the things I like to look at when I'm diving into something. Like you have these questions of how deep do you want to go, and when do you hit bedrock, when do you know to go further, and that's why I like to peel the onion back just enough to find all right, what's the reference? What is the influence, and kind of getting that sense, and it's concentrated. And if you listen to enough things, I remember I was doing my, I'll tell you about this later, but I was doing my dive into Treme, and I was like, oh, I've heard this rhythm before. I've heard this somewhere before. I was like, what is this? And I'm going down this rabbit hole, right? So describe, and you were definitely touching on it, at least the sensibilities that are attached. Describe your current work, music curator at the New Orleans Jazz Museum, and talk about the mission a little bit for those who are undipped.
Being the curator here, there's basically two jobs. One is curating exhibits, putting together exhibits that showcase mainly jazz, but also the music of Louisiana. Yeah. And putting that out there in a way that is true to the history and yet relevant to people today, kind of thing. Which is not, it is a little difficult, but isn't that difficult. I can easily find connections, and most people can when they look to how, however old the music is, how it is relevant to us today, especially in New Orleans, where all of the kinds of music from Louisiana just about are still being played around here or in the somewhere along in the state. Yeah. So I'm always trying to come up with ideas for exhibits, and I do that with the exhibits curators and my supervisor Greg Lambusi is the director. He has all sorts of ideas, and it also depends on how we decide that as kind of what's in the collection, what's around, what is kind of timely. One of the first exhibits I put together was on Professor Longhair, because it was a centennial. Yes. And I was kind of like, no one's really ever done a Fess exhibit, and we really should. We have some of this stuff. I know people who played with him. It's Professor Longhair, you can't. And it's important. And I also feel that as I'm putting together exhibits, it is important to highlight folks who have not been highlighted, and to kind of make sure that, especially when it's black folks who have not necessarily been featured in kind of official cultural Louisiana, to make sure that they get their due and people start seeing the history of that kind of thing. And Professor Longhair was kind of like, it's the first time that an incredible but poor black pianist got an exhibit in the Jazz Museum.
100%. And. I like that. I like hearing how that's a focus of is it relevant now? Does it make sense? It looks like, how can this be so? But also, it doesn't take a lot of work. I like how you describe. It's not easy, but also it can be done.
Not that, and also it's Louisiana. And there's no end to people that you can feature and figure out and do exhibits on. It's hard to choose between them.
And that's kind of one of the things, in starting off doing this podcast, I told the story many a times that I got this challenge early on. Baltimore is a
not a small town per se, right? And New Orleans is, I think, half the size of Baltimore in terms of the number of people. But New Orleans is never deemed as like a small town, big on culture, right?
Yeah.
And I remember getting this challenge from a friend when I was thinking about doing this podcast. And literally the challenge was, I'd be surprised if you can find 20 interesting artistic people in Baltimore. It's wild, right?
I could probably find 40 in an hour's research, I would think, but I don't know,
But even being in there, and then, I'm like, I'll take this as a challenge. And at one point I did like 18 interviews in a week. Mm-hmm. So it's just like, no, you just got to look. Yeah, look beyond. How are you defining who are the approved upon people that make up what is arts and culture, or to a more pointed point, what is jazz, or what is the music of a place, right? And it's just like, you can find it. You just got to know where to look. And you just got to know how to look. And what is your sort of rubric and your definition of sort of the curation that goes into it. So when I'm doing this and like putting together this month of interviews that has a focus on jazz music, I was like, I can't not go down to New Orleans. That was literally the thing. Like, what am I goofing? What am I doing? And folks will say, oh, well, you're doing so many interviews. Are you going to be more curated in it? I was like, well, there is curation. You just don't understand it.
Right. Yeah.
So
let me just finish one thing. The other half of my job is taking care of the archive, which is in the wing over there. It is, give or take, 70,000 pieces, photographs, sheet music, instruments, records, 78s, assorted esoterica. And that is basically kind of, the music attic of Louisiana. So it ranges everything from, Sidney Bechet's 1940s soprano saxophone to Clifton Cheniere's Grammy to Tuba Fatz's
that's a great name,
sneakers, to, I want to say we have photos of Lil Wayne and do we have Mystical sneakers? Might have had one of Mystical's awards, but the whole entire Clifton Cheniere's crown, the entire range of kind of music across the state, and my job is to make sure that we get more of that and it gets preserved and it gets put out there when people need. Oh, I need photos of Louis Prima. Okay, here we have photos of Louis Prima here. Put them out for whatever news broadcast or book you need. So,
is there in terms of the items that are within the archive, is there one that just comes to mind that has like? That was either really super, super old, super rare, super like, this was a wild story of how we got this. And I asked that because I did this screening of A Summer of Soul. Mm-hmm. And the whole story about how that happened this was just in a dusty attic for 50 years. And then someone said, oh yeah, we should restore this. And then the whole cutting process and bringing all of that together. So I'm always interested in like how something gets there. It's like,
I'll give you two examples. That was the kind of attic story. First, we have Louis Armstrong's the cornet that he learned to play on.
Oh, wow.
That he played in the Waifs home when he was there. Yeah. It was not his first cornet because he had one before he went in there, but it's the one that when he was there and he really figured out how to play, and this was like, wait, this is actually really something I want to do, and this can keep me from a life on the streets and all that. That even though he still had a slight life on the streets, and they had it in. Once Armstrong got out, they loaned it to him. So that he had something to play and said, whenever you have enough money to buy your own, please return this to us. So within about a year, he bought his own, he returned it to him. It was stayed as being like, the band cornet until Armstrong became famous and he came back and they kind of took it out of circulation. But every, once or twice a year, they'd bring it out to the band and say, see this? That guy who's singing Stardust and Blueberry Hill and all that, he played this right where you are. So you also can be like him. This is what he played. And then when the Waifs home closed, the band director kept it, and he ended up his widow ended up donating it to us, and when Armstrong came in '65, hung out at the Jazz Museum. Peter Davis, the guy who had it, brought it up and said, "Here, remember this?" And Armstrong listens and goes, "Oh yeah, I remember this." And he points to, and you can see this downstairs. He points to, there are notches in the mouthpiece. He said, "I put those there so it would make it easier to play the high notes or something." And we're like, "Oh my god!" Wow. So yeah, we still have that, and that I still, it's on display, it's on permanent display, but every so often I have to, clean it, pull it out and stuff, and every time I pick it up, my hands shake. Every time. I'm never, ever going to get used to the fact that, oh my God, that's where it all starts, right there. Right there is where okay, so that's one, but in the same kind of attic idea, what we recently got into the collection, when you go downstairs, you'll see the kind of 12-foot mural that happened from Dixie's Bar of Music, the Gonzalez mural. And that was in a bar that was in several different places. It was a music bar, but it was also in the 30s, 40s, 50s. It was a gay bar, especially at a time where you couldn't be gay, and it was you could be arrested for it. It was in the French Quarter for a while, and it was before that it was on St. Charles Avenue. And it was, Tennessee Williams hung out there, musicians hung out there, Truman Capote hung out there. It was the place you came. Yeah. And about a year ago, the building where it had been sold, and they were having an auction of the stuff they found there, and they found the doors, say Dixie's Bar of Music, that were literally up in the attic for 50 years. Wow. And we put in a bid on them, and we got them, and they're in another storage facility up the street that we are working on getting them conserved and put, we're going to bring them in here and put them up someplace near the mural. I'm not quite sure where. But that kind of thing where, oh yeah, this was up in an attic for 50 years, and we found them, and it's like, and it intersects not only the kind of music, and also we have probably the State Museum has probably the largest collection one of the largest collections of Mardi Gras stuff, but certainly the largest collection of gay Mardi Gras in probably the world, I want to say. And it kind of it's the intersection of both those kind of things, because it was a huge, this was a place everyone hung out at Mardi Gras, and if you've been here for the gay Mardi Gras, so over the top, it's in the best of ways. And it kind of like, oh yeah, it was a music bar and it was a gay bar, and it also was a huge Mardi Gras celebration kind of thing. So it intersects all those three things. So yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So I have two real questions, and then we got the rapid fire questions. Even you get the rapid fire questions.
Okay, I will take the rapid fire questions.
So taking in account like this really like vast career as you've been breaking down, and I'm sitting here trying not to fanboy out, as I'm listening. What would you say, like a piece of advice you would share with someone who wants to go into, they want to do what you do, and there's multiple things that you're doing, from the music curation side, from being a historian, from being a DJ, all of these different things, and maybe a humble podcaster might be also very interested in this answer.
Right. All right, do it. In the same way of like the do-it-yourself we were talking about earlier, punk rock and jazz, figure out a way to do it and do it. It's the possibilities now versus, there were lots of possibilities when I was coming up doing it, but the possibilities now with the internet and technology and stuff, vastly more. You just have to do it. You have to find what you're passionate about and follow it. And on the whole, you have to love it, because you're not going to make a goddamn dime at it.
That's a great answer.
If you can figure out ways to possibly slightly monetize it, it is possible, but don't anticipate being able to make money at it. But certainly try to. There are ways, just because it took me a long time and to figure out a way to like actually get paid for it. You're going to be doing it a long time without getting paid, but the rewards to your soul and your well-being and the spirit, people don't think about this necessarily when they're doing their passions or their jobs, that you still need money to eat and pay your rent, and it's harder and harder every day. But you also need to do it helps in your world and your mental health and your general well-being to be doing something you're passionate about and fulfills your spirit. that is worth something. To be able to go home, to wherever you're living, happy, even though you're 3 steps above broke, it certainly is worth something. And as much as going to wherever your large house and whatever job you are making gazillions of dollars at, yet you get there and you're like, what am I doing? You hear so many stories of people who are making in that position. You're like, my soul was not fulfilled. And then you're unhappy. And if you're unhappy and your soul is not fulfilled, your life will be shortened. And be less meaningful.
I feel that because, like in doing this, been podcasting for 14 years, been doing this one for 4, but this one felt like the natural progression. It was like, what am I being called to do? And I told you the story why I got started and I'm invested in these things. And, it's like, this is going to feel like something. And I don't, you hear all the time, oh, you should monetize. You need to have this many downloads and blah, blah, blah. It's like, I don't care about those. And as someone slides in and they're giving you feedback and you have these sort of funding conversations just to have structure around it, because you still have to have your life. I don't want to be those 3 steps. I want to maybe be 4 steps away from being broke. Yeah. But you want to have that sorted, and you have just external factors in your ear that are kind of taken away from maybe your reasoning. As I said earlier, maybe you should curate it a little bit differently. No. Yeah. And, I dig that.
You can't not be you have to have it all integrated. You have to be thinking about making money, and you have to be thinking about how it's getting out to people and all that. But that cannot be the overwhelming kind of thing.
Can't be the preoccupation.
It cannot be the preoccupation. It needs to be integrated into the entire whole of the thing. And as, not to speak of, but as we get into these periods of late capitalism where that, I want to say it's always been emphasized, but more and more these days, of how you make the money, because the way things are going, there's more of it for everybody up there, there's less of it for all the rest of us. And that's possibly by design, but that's another entire conversation.
But I think
making it an integrated part of your world and making sure that you get some kind of spiritual fulfillment out of it will help you in your happiness, will help you make better art, will help you make better history, and will just make you feel better. Make you happier.
And I think simplicity is key. And as you put it, it's just like, do it, figure the thing out. Yeah. And I think
ask
all of that is a part of it.
Everyone, find people who are doing what you want to do. And again, it's much easier to communicate with people these days. Ask questions. Ask folks, how did you get into making podcasts? How did you get into painting? How did you get into all of these things?
That might be why I flew down to New Orleans.
Right. I'm certainly, and most people are happy to tell you, I'm always looking for the folks who were like me when I was 25, hungry to find out who Tommy Ridgely was and how he made this music kind of stuff,
So this is the last real question I got for you, and you were kind of touching on it a little bit. What's next? Really, like, what's on the horizon in the next, let's say, year or so? Like, what do you have?
There are, let's see, in 2 weeks, we're opening a small version of the King Oliver Creole Jazz Band exhibit, because the 100th anniversary of the first kind of really great jazz recordings was 2 weeks ago. King Oliver, Louis Armstrong's first recordings, and King Oliver's first, the incredible Canal Street Blues and Jumpermouth Blues, and Zulu's ball, the Zulu King Ball, or whatever that one is. But some of the best of the early jazz recordings that are still like, you listen to those like, oh, that's how you're supposed to play this stuff. So we're opening that at Jazz Fest, and then a slightly bigger version of it downstairs for Satchmo Fest, which is the festival here at about Louis Armstrong, which is the first weekend in August. And then the Louis Prima exhibit that's been open for a few years is moving to the Italian American Museum in Los Angeles, so I got to work on that. And then October, we are opening a Fats Domino exhibit.
Nice.
And Dave Bartholomew exhibit, which should be lots of fun. That's going to be, I'm really looking forward to that. Because the Fats Domino's music, we all know it, we all listen to it, but the more you listen to it, the more it's kind of a certain way, the essence of New Orleans, and there's a certain, it's very simple, but there's a certain mystique to it that the more you get into, you're like, whoa, kind of thing. These 3-minute songs that we all know. And then eventually we are slowly but surely working on big permanent exhibit, the history of jazz in New Orleans. Starting from Congo Square and the French Opera and street musicians all the way up through Jonathan Batiste, Aurora Nealand, Helen Gillet, all the people here, Trombone Shorty, all of that. So that's, Christian Scott, or what is Christian's name? He changed his name and I want to get it right. Christian Atunde Adjua, or Chief Adjua these days. But Christian, I know him as Christian Scott, but killer trumpet player and beautiful musician, great guy. So
That's amazing.
yeah, there's no end to exhibits to be done and stuff to be found. So
lots of history, and so shout out to you.
Thank
shout
you.
out to the work that's going on here. So I got 5 rapid fire questions for you. Don't overthink them.
Okay.
You know how rapid fire works. You radio guy. What was the first jazz record you owned?
Count Basie's Greatest Hits.
I'm going to save this last one because I think it's funny. What is the story behind your staff pick in the New Orleans Museum? I wasn't
you
going
mean
to
the one with the sunglasses and the fringe jacket?
It is the best thing. I told my girl, I was like, I'm interviewing this guy. She was like, is he going to turn you into a vampire?
Right. The story behind that is the idea most people get of when you talk to the guy who is the jazz curator is a guy slightly balding, smoking a pipe, corduroy arm patches on his jacket, talking about these how great Pete Fountain, not that Pete Fountain wasn't great, but that kind of thing. Yeah. I wanted to make sure that image is at least a little cooler, even though, as my wife says, oh, that's very 80s cool.
It is.
But it's still, I want you to look like, okay, this guy actually might be kind of different, And there are lots of other writers and folks who are curators and historians of music and stuff who cultivate an image kind of like that. Yeah. There are a couple of like, I don't want to look like that, slightly staid and that dude. I want to look like the cool guy.
I was like, oh, that's.
I mean, yes, it's cool via 1988, but still,
that's Wolfman Dave right there.
Yeah, exactly.
What is your go-to lazy dinner?
My go-to lazy dinner, penne chicken. It's not that easy. The go-to, I guess the go-to lazy dinner, probably some kind of Asian dumpling. Just
Okay.
warm those up.
New Orleans definitely has signature drinks. Mm-hmm. Do you have a signature drink?
When I'm getting fancy, it's a Sazerac or Chartreuse.
My man.
I actually am a part of an entire cult of Chartreuse. A whole bunch of my friends and I, we've been drinking this stuff forever. When I'm not being fancy, it's generally, these days it's if it's daytime, it's flavored vodka and soda. If it's nighttime, it's Jack Daniels and soda, and then there's beer.
I dig it.
No.
The last one I got for you, because you can either take it as your favorite or is it too often used. But what is that term for you within the jazz lexicon, culturally speaking? Because cats has been thrown around a lot. Mm-hmm. What is the word for you to I've heard this a lot, or this is my favorite term within the whole sort of jazz lexicon?
The term that I cannot stand to encompass anything jazz or certainly anything New Orleans is the G word. Anytime you call something a gumbo.
Oh no!
It is the most overused. And don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
It's correct. It is correct, and it works because the entire idea of creolization and that the gumbo is you take lots of different ingredients and it becomes something in and of itself.
Yeah.
Which is what New Orleans and Louisiana is in general. That there's Sicilian influence, there's African American influence, there's Irish influence, there's all sorts of stuff, and you put it all together, it becomes the culture of Louisiana or New Orleans. But anytime, it is such an overused cliche to say, oh, it's just like a gumbo.
I think I've said that one time, maybe 15 years ago, when it came to a corporate meeting, and I immediately wanted to burn my hands.
Right.
And also, isn't gumbo okra? Isn't that the word, or have you?
I think the original gumbo, I want to say it's African, and it does mean okra or stew.
Yeah.
And I'm not, it definitely, I think if you go to Senegal or West Africa and you say gumbo, they'll know it's the same kind of thing, maybe a little more tomatoey, but.
Yes, it seems like it's a shortcut. It's just a shortcut term.
Right. But it is a shortcut, easy term, but it does make sense because of lots of cliches. There is certainly a grain of somewhat truth, even, old truth to it that reading years ago as, gumbo, it becomes something in and of itself with all the different ingredients, as Kalama Yasalam, a great sociologist and historian and writer down here once said, he was remarking on the fact that he was watching the St. Joseph's Day parade. Yeah. Not the Mardi Gras Indians, but the St. Joseph, the more formal one that was happening on St. Patrick's Day. Yeah. And he was remarking on the fact that everyone was second lining. He said, only in New Orleans are people doing an African-American dance at an Italian-American parade on an Irish-American holiday. And and no one's remarking upon it. It's just what we do, kind of thing. That's really great.
That's amazing. So that's pretty much it for the podcast.
Okay.
We got everything. But I want to at least open it up in the last moments here to give you the space. And again, thank you for coming on. But give you the space to share anything that you have, social media, website, here, what have you. The floor is yours.
I guess that, please visit the New Orleans Jazz Museum website, nolajazzmuseum.org. If you're in town, please come and visit. We've got 3 floors of exhibits and performances 3 or 4 times a week. It's on the corner of Esplanade and Decatur, literally on the corner of the French Quarter in the largest and probably most solid building in town. The building was, before it was the Jazz Museum, was a mint, a fort, a jail. So even though it is one of our challenges in getting people in to come in is that it's a very imposing building. So we ask you to come in. I mean, it's bricks. It's huge. It's 3 stories. The walls are 6 feet thick, kind of thing. It was a mint. It was a jail. You don't want people to get in. It's one of our challenges, getting people in. But come by. Actually, recently now that we now have a tornado season in New Orleans, there was a tornado warning when I was here. And my kids and my wife were back home uptown, and the kids were calling, going, "Are you going to be okay?" I mean, they're in the closet and stuff. And I said, there is 10 feet of brick between me and the outside right now. I'm in the most solid building, probably in the lower Mississippi River Valley. Okay, now, I mean, if it's, yes, anything can happen, but now I will be okay. So I'd say, please come by. In terms of me personally, my documentaries are up on the on a YouTube channel my brother put together for me. So if you ever want to check them out, David Kunian on YouTube. There's probably 10 or 12 of them. All radio, so you got to listen. There's nothing. We're old school. Use your ears. And I guess the last thing is I'm going to be. I cannot believe this, celebrating 30 years of doing a radio show on WWOZ, which is, or www.org, the community radio station for New Orleans. Currently, my show is 10 to midnight on Tuesday nights. They call it the Kitchen Sink, which basically means, the title of the series, each one is a kitchen sink. I call them on the Freaknologist Lunatique Show. It's, I get to play basically whatever I want. So a lot of times, sometimes it's like tonight it will be pretty heavy avant-garde jazz. Other times it will be blues or birthdays or whatever's new or whatever's local kind of stuff. So that's 10 p.m. to midnight Central Time. I'm trying to think of anything else. No, that's all I can think of right now. Come by the Jazz Museum. There's all it is your mama's jazz, but it also ain't your mama's jazz.
And there you have it, folks. I want to again thank David Kunian for coming on to the podcast. And I'm Rob Lee, saying that there's art, culture, and a bit of jazz in and around your neck of the woods. You just got to look for it.